So interestingly enough, I talked to my mother last night and got a little bit more of the background, which was really nice for me so that I can tell you. When I was 3, my parents, who graduated both with degrees from the University of Washington in Seattle, decided to go to get their master's degrees at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And what my mother told me yesterday is that they got some money that they had not been expecting, and they knew they could either keep it to spend when they got back to Seattle after they were done with their degrees, or they could take the 6 weeks of their summer break and go on vacation. And they decided to go on vacation because they didn't know if they would ever make it back to the northeast portion of the states again. So they traveled from Ann Arbor through Ontario and down at Niagara Falls. And they had friends in Maine and friends in Boston, and they'd never been to New York City. So they decided to go, and they also went to Washington, D.C. So in New York City, they decided they were going to go to the Statue of Liberty. And that's in part because my father's, one set of my father's grandparents, my great-grandparents, actually immigrated to the United States through Ellis Island. And so they really wanted to go to the Statue of Liberty. So they went to the Statue of Liberty, and of course it's on that ferry, and that's where that photo was taken with New York in the background. And the interesting thing for me is that is my very earliest actual memory, is going up the spiral staircase in the Statue of Liberty to the top of it. And my mother was pregnant, and so I basically saw everybody's knees, being age 3.5, 4, my mother's stomach. At one point, I very clearly remember my father picking me up and sort of leaning me over the railing so I could look down on the heads of everybody else on the spiral staircase. And then when we finally got to the top and people sort of spread out around the crown or the head or whatever it was to look out the windows, it was like, wow, I'm not looking just at people's knees and my mom's stomach. So it's my very earliest personal memory, is going up those stairs at the Statue of Liberty. So my dad passed away last year, but he took slides throughout his whole life. He was a research biologist up in Alaska a lot. And about 5 years ago, when he'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, my husband started scanning all of his slides so that we could potentially go through the ones specifically in Alaska, where only he knew the information. And there were a bunch in there, of course, of family vacations also. And I had never seen this photo of me before until about 4 or 5 years ago. No, there was this whole little chunk of about 15, 20 slides that are called Marty's baby photos. And there's ones in there of my first steps and riding a horse at Woodland Park Zoo, one of the little pony rides, and a lot over with my grandparents in Sunnyside, where we went every summer. But it was really adorable. I'd never seen these photos before. I saw that and all I thought is, oh my gosh, I'm styling. I have the whole model spout and everything. I don't know where that came from, but I was obviously very secure in myself at that point. And there's some of me that wishes I still had that sort of innocent security. I mean, as you get older, you have self-security and self-confidence in other ways, but not quite that innocent self-confidence. And the whole matching red shoes and belt and sweater and just not having a care in the world, it really did. It brought back some memories of my childhood, not only of that trip, which was quite a good trip, and I have a really good relationship with my parents and my siblings. I'm very lucky in that, but also just spending a lot of time with grandparents and cousins. And, I am very lucky. I did have a very good childhood. And so seeing that picture is just one more piece of evidence of that. Being the only grandchild on both sides, there are a lot of photos of me at a young age, but not ever having seen that one, it has ended up being really one of my favorites now that I have it. I am the oldest, and my mother was pregnant with my next in line brother. He was born after we got back to Seattle. So I was the only grandchild on both sides of the family for 4.5 years. And I exulted in it. I was spoiled rotten, and I will admit it. So no siblings until after we got back to Seattle. And at that point, I was very excited until we'd had him home about 6 weeks, at which point I told my mother we needed to return him to the hospital. That's where we got him from. That's where we had to return him to. When I was working on the East Coast, I did a real quick business trip, but didn't make it to the Statue of Liberty. But I did go when I went back to New York about 6 years ago. And I did specifically go because I do a fair amount of genealogy. And I learned more about when my great-grandparents had gone through Ellis Island. And Ellis Island was now, when I went back in the 60s with my parents, Ellis Island was not available because it hadn't been restored. You could go to the statue, but you couldn't go to Ellis Island. And so I really wanted to go both to the Statue of Liberty and to Ellis Island to honor my great-grandparents. I didn't end up climbing the stairs because they have it very limited these days, and I was not there at the time frame that it made sense to, but I did stand at the base of them, and I did take a photograph of it. Not really. I ended up sort of backing into becoming an attorney. If I have any attorneys in my family, it's back 4 or 5 generations. But I worked in Washington, D.C. a couple years out of college. My undergraduate is in art history, of all things, from the University of Washington. And the attorneys I was working for in Washington, D.C., I was doing a lot of real estate. And I walked into the office of one of my attorneys when I was working as a paralegal, and I looked at him and I said, "Paul, what's a contract?" And he said, "Oh, Marty, that's a year-long class in law school. If you want the answer to that, you have to go to law school." I said, "I don't want to go to law school. I don't want attorneys as peers." And needless to say, a couple years later, I went to law school. So I do transactional law. I don't do litigation, but I really did sort of back into it. Though, as I said, I am a genealogist and historian. And so it's very important to me in that context. I said my great-grandparents came into the United States. They immigrated from Russia. They were Germans that were living in Russia, and they immigrated separately about a year apart. And both of them came through Ellis Island. And so their first views of the United States would have been the Statue of Liberty. And I have other ancestors that have been here somewhat longer, but that really is a symbol of invitation to the United States. So I was born at Group Health on Capitol Hill, and I was raised near Green Lake. My dad worked at the University of Washington, and my mom was a teacher. And my dad was born in Seattle and was raised in West Seattle. And my grandfather was born in Blaine, Washington, and moved to Seattle and Tacoma area when he was about 6. So I'm a 3rd-generation Washingtonian. My partner and I live in Portland because this is where a lot of my practice is, but my whole family still lives in the Seattle area. And so we were living part-time here and part-time in Seattle. And when we were living in Seattle, we were living in West Seattle. And it brought a lot of good memories from my childhood because we'd go there to see my dad's parents. Opposite. I, of course, grew up in Seattle. I went to Whitman, and then I went back and graduated from the University of Washington. But when I applied for law school, I got accepted here at Lewis and Clark. And so since I had connections here in Portland, I took the Oregon bar, but then 6 months later, I immediately took the Washington bar because all my family's in Washington. So I've been licensed in both states ever since, but most of my practice is here in Oregon.